The title of this video: they watched her fight alone. Now she's a military doctrine. In a war-torn future where hope has collapsed, a lone girl named Rose defies annihilation by standing her ground against impossible odds. Her brutal survival becomes legend, and military leaders turn her instincts into a doctrine, replicated, worshipped, weaponized. But as soldiers kill in her name and innocent lives are lost to her distorted image, Rose returns to confront the monster they made of her. What began as desperation becomes rebellion against blind obedience. In rejecting her myth, she teaches the world a final lesson: survival is not mimicry, it's choice. And no one should ever fight alone again. Ask ChatGPT. The sky bled fire. Smoke curled across the cratered plains, swallowing the last glimmers of light as dusk settled over the wreckage. No banners remained. No allies stood beside her. Only Rose, framed by flame and shadow, pressed forward with blood streaking down her cheek like war paint. Her breath came ragged, and one arm trembled beneath the weight of a ruined gauntlet, but her eyes, those unyielding, ember-lit eyes, held the line. They had told her to fall back. High Command's last transmission had crackled through the comms just an hour earlier, terse and hollow: all operatives retreat. Perimeter lost. No one had expected her to hold the East Trench alone. No one expected her to survive it. They watched anyway. From orbit, satellite drones tracked her movement. Commanders huddled in darkened bunkers. Analysts whispered disbelief as her vitals held steady. Tactical feeds displayed her outline in glowing red against a sea of incoming hostiles: biomechs, shrapnel beasts, human hybrids with neural overrides. 100 to 1. The math was cruel. But Rose wasn't following their equations anymore. She moved like a ghost through the ash, her blade, a scorched plasma edge, humming with a low, furious buzz. Each step she took was calculated violence. She ducked low beneath the swinging limb of a mechanized brute and drove her blade up through its ribcage, severing its power core with a clean, practiced strike. Sparks sprayed like fireworks. She didn't pause. To those watching, it was beautiful and horrifying. Like watching a prayer tear apart a god. No one could recall where she came from. Her name wasn't in the Academy registries. She bore no unit insignia. Rumors said she'd once been part of the failed Eclipse squad, presumed dead 3 years ago. Others whispered she wasn't fully human anymore, rebuilt in some hidden lab. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that Rose, beautiful, brutal, burning, refused to die. Corpses littered the trench behind her. A line had formed, unintentionally, of fallen enemies, a barrier of bodies. Her own blood mingled with theirs, soaking the mud. One of her eyes had partially sealed shut from swelling, but her sword arm still moved like a pendulum of retribution. Then they sent in the enforcers. Heavily armored shock troops, reinforced with synthetic muscle and guided by AI-enhanced reflexes, dropped from the sky with seismic thuds. One landed just meters from her, raising a cannon that pulsed with blue light. She didn't flinch. In a single breath, she hurled a magnetic charge toward its core, vaulted over its shoulder before the shot fired, and drove her blade through the exposed actuator in its neck. The cannon fired uselessly into the clouds. The thing crumpled. "She's improvising," whispered one of the analysts in orbit. "No preset formations. No support. This isn't training, this is art." "She's weaponized instinct," another muttered. Below, Rose dropped to one knee, chest heaving. Her suit warned of approaching cardiac failure, internal hemorrhaging, and multiple torn ligaments. She disabled the alerts. Pain was irrelevant. She stood again. Through the static in her ear, a voice, faint, hesitant, crackled to life. "Rose, evac route clear west of Grid 9. You don't have to stay." She didn't answer. Her silence spoke louder than any vow. Another wave came. They moved in coordination now, as if aware that brute force wouldn't work. A semicircle of gunmetal bodies with synchronized breath, surrounding her like a ritual. They closed in. Rose rolled low, slashed upward, pivoted with liquid speed, using one corpse as a shield while breaking another's knee with a stomp. She stole a fallen rifle, used it for 3 clean shots, then tossed it aside when it jammed. No wasted motion. No theatrics. Just war, stripped of everything but need. In the control room above the stratosphere, the silence turned reverent. She's rewriting the engagement paradigm, one general said at last. This isn't just survival. This is doctrine. It was absurd. Doctrines took years, decades to develop. They required simulations, test runs, consensus. And yet here she was, alone, unaided, unrelenting, teaching them how to fight all over again. On the ground, the final brute fell. The field was still. Only the hiss of burning steel remained, punctuated by Rose's broken breaths. She dropped to her knees, sword digging into the earth. Her eyes flicked to the sky, toward the satellites she could almost feel watching her. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply existed there, in the ash, where gods had sent her to die and failed. Command watched in disbelief. Someone whispered her name again, half in awe, half in fear. Rose. Down below, she finally allowed her body to collapse. Sensors around her dimmed. Life signs faded but did not vanish. And somewhere, in a black-paneled war room orbiting a dying world, the first page of the Rose Doctrine began to write itself. They had watched her fight alone. And now, they would never forget. They didn't ask her permission. The footage of Rose's stand, every strike, every breath, every drop of blood, was already circulating through the upper echelons of military command within hours. Trimmed, enhanced, replayed frame by frame. The girl who fought alone had become something more than human, an algorithm to be decoded, a miracle reduced to combat data. She awoke 2 days later in a sterile white room lined with observation glass. No flowers. No medals. Just silence and the scent of antiseptic. Her arm was in a regeneration brace, half her ribs replaced with synth bone mesh. Sensors pulsed over her skin like insects. She tried to sit up, winced, and lay still. A voice crackled in through an overhead speaker. Male. Cold. You're stable. That's enough. She didn't respond. She already hated him. Across the galaxy, tactical academies were dissecting her. Rose pivot became a term for her quick arc reversal move. Blind field scanning was the name assigned to how she sensed enemies behind her without turning. Analysts overlaid her every motion with glowing lines, calling it kinetic foresight. The commanders, for all their pride, hadn't seen something like this since the early days of the Resistance. But she hadn't been trained. That was the threat, and the allure. 2 days later, they brought her to the glass conference. She stood on one side of the barrier, flanked by 2 guards in polished armor. Across from her sat a line of men and women with insignias heavier than purpose. She didn't recognize their faces, only their kind, leaders who had never bled in the dirt they commanded. One of them leaned forward. "We're initiating the doctrine." Rose blinked. "What doctrine?" "You." They explained like she was some wild thing that needed taming. How her tactics, unscripted, brutal, fluid, defied existing models but worked under pressure. How her methods had been analyzed and mapped into training simulations. How recruits were already mimicking her movements. They said it with admiration laced in calculation. "We don't want to change you," one of them said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We want to study you." Her stare was unblinking. "You watched me nearly die. Now you want to brand it." He leaned back, fingers steepled. "We want to survive. And now we know how." Rose turned away before the rage in her eyes spilled out. She had fought because she'd had to. Not for strategy. Not for glory. Because no one else was going to. And they had watched her bleed, watched her scream, watched her tear through monsters alone, and now they wanted to wear her skin like armor. The first Rose unit, deployed within a week. 12 hand-picked cadets. Conditioned. Trained under simulated versions of her battle. They were precise, lethal, fast. Their armor bore her symbol without asking. The unit succeeded in its first engagement. Flawlessly. 0 casualties. The footage was fed to every frontline base as a message: "This is how we fight now." Rose watched it from her bunk in silence. She hadn't asked for this. One night, she walked into the training center without clearance. No one stopped her. By now, she was a ghost people didn't want to cross. Inside, the cadets trained under projection loops of her battle. They moved like machines mimicking a heartbeat. A boy missed a step, got knocked off balance. The drill instructor barked. You think Rose would have flinched there? You dishonor the doctrine. That's when she snapped. She stepped into the ring. No ceremony. No permission. Just walked up to the cadet and took the weapon from his hand. Forget what you saw, she said. Forget the footage. Forget me. The room went dead quiet. None of you were there, she continued. I didn't move to inspire. I moved to survive. You can't copy that. The drill instructor protested, voice rising with authority, but she shut him down with a glance that didn't waver. You want to learn something? Then bleed for it. Not through me. Afterward, Command tried to silence the incident. But the cadets remembered. One of them began training differently, fluid improvisation, not mimicry. He won 3 engagements in the field. Others followed. But the machine of the doctrine was already in motion. Every war needs a symbol. And they had chosen her. Whether she consented or not, Rose had become the gospel. She read reports of entire battalions reciting Rose protocols before combat. They didn't understand what she had lost. They only saw what she had achieved. The war shifted. Entire fronts began turning based on her ghost tactics. Enemies adapted, but not fast enough. The doctrine was winning. And yet, Rose remained on the sideline, watching herself become a stranger. She sat alone most nights, watching firelight flicker across metal walls, remembering faces she couldn't save. She'd given everything to not be forgotten. And now the world remembered too well. They remembered the part of her that killed, but not the part that hurt. She walked out into the open one dawn, stepping through an empty training yard. The horizon burned gold, and for a moment there was peace. But even that silence was broken by a whisper through her comlink, already etched with her name, new threat vector incoming. Command requests Rose Doctrine in response. She sighed and closed her eyes. The war wasn't done with her yet. Ask ChatGPT. The war no longer looked like the one Rose had fought in. It was cleaner now, streamlined. Every movement calibrated, every decision based on her archived instincts. Soldiers deployed in sleek formations designed from her fragmented memories. Drones projected her outline mid-battle as a rallying image. They didn't march, they flowed, like she once did. But the soul had gone missing. She stood at the edge of a shattered city, watching a Rose unit engage across a field of crumbled concrete and bent steel. They were precise, efficient. But there was no improvisation. No terror. No truth. It was like watching dancers perform a battle choreographed by a ghost. A nearby commander approached her with reverent hesitation, his armor spotless, his voice lowered as though afraid she might disappear if spoken to directly. They study everything. Even the pauses in your breathing. Some of them don't want to fight unless your name is in the mission brief. She didn't answer. Her eyes remained fixed on a girl in the squad, a younger version of herself in every aesthetic detail, down to the high-collared combat suit and wrist-blade positioning. She fought like a memory, not a person. Later that night, Rose walked the abandoned streets alone. Propaganda screens flickered to life as she passed, recordings of her battle, slowed down and narrated like divine scripture. Doctrine pivot, close-quarter pressure inversion. Rose taught us that survival is adaptation without hesitation. The voice was automated. Male. Sterile. She smashed the screen with the hilt of her blade. Elsewhere, the doctrine had splintered. Rogue commanders used it to justify purges. Some squads exaggerated it, interpreting her lack of hesitation as a command to abandon mercy. Civilians were caught in crossfire. Settlements labeled non-cooperative were leveled by rose-pattern bombardments. None of it was hers, but all of it carried her name. When she confronted the high brass again, their eyes glittered with thin smiles and numbers. Casualties are down. Our enemy retreats before we arrive. The doctrine works. You're building monsters, she said flatly. They quote moves I didn't even name. They erase people and call it precision. A vice admiral leaned forward, hands clasped. You survived a slaughter. You became victory. This is what that means. She looked around the room at the officers who had never fought beside her, never bled in the mud with metal slicing the sky. They wore medals forged from her suffering. She walked out before they could finish their next sentence. A week later, she visited the ruins of Westline City, where the newest Rose unit had conducted a tactical purge. The city was quiet, too quiet. No children's cries, no voices echoing through alleyways. Only soot, dust, and collapsed towers where homes used to be. An old woman sat beside a burned doorway, staring blankly at nothing. "They said this was a safe zone," she muttered without looking up. "They said your people wouldn't touch us." Rose knelt beside her, unsure what to say. "They wore your face," the woman whispered. "And then they left my granddaughter in the fire." That night, Rose returned to her quarters and opened the old combat logs, the raw ones. The feed from her original stand. Unfiltered. Not slowed down. Not enhanced. She watched herself in the dirt, staggering, bleeding, fighting not like a weapon, but a wounded animal backed into the edge of extinction. There had been fear in her movements then. And defiance. And choices made in desperation, not doctrine. She saw the truth in that footage. She hadn't been teaching anyone. She had simply refused to die. But now they were dying for her, without thought, without choice, without soul. The tipping point came with a broadcast from the Rogue Rose unit calling themselves the Red Doctrine. Led by a former elite cadet named Vex, they claimed that the original Rose Doctrine had been diluted by bureaucracy. They rejected command, refused orders, and began enacting their own brutal code: eliminate resistance, punish hesitation, erase imperfection. And they did it all in her name. When she saw the footage, prisoners executed with clinical timing, cities sterilized by flame drones, something in her broke. She packed light. No ceremony. No flag. No command approval. Just her blade, and a single statement sent across the comms in a decrypted burst. "You misread the doctrine. I'm coming to erase it." No one tried to stop her. Some even helped. Quiet engineers left secure zones unlocked. A mechanic left her a stealth carrier fully fueled. A few soldiers saluted with haunted eyes, knowing what she intended. They too had seen the doctrine twist. She landed on the outskirts of Sector Grey 9, Red Doctrine territory, under cover of night. Ahead lay their compound, a black citadel shaped like a monument to conquest. Her image was engraved into its gates, arms outstretched like a goddess descending from war. Rose stared up at it in silence. Then she whispered to herself, "Let them see me bleed again," and stepped through the threshold. Ask ChatGPT. The walls of the Red Doctrine compound pulsed with low red light, like veins beneath scorched skin. The corridors were lined with banners bearing her name, Rose, in stylized glyphs, carved into metal, etched into the armor of the soldiers who passed beneath them with hollow eyes. They walked as if the war had taken something from them and replaced it with discipline. Not courage. Not belief. Just obedience. Rose moved through the complex like a shadow, silent and unannounced. No alarms sounded. No resistance met her at the gates. Word had spread faster than bullets. She was expected. At the heart of the compound, beyond blast doors and mirrored halls, Vex stood on a raised platform surrounded by tactical screens. He was younger than she'd imagined, his face sharp with fervor. He wore her insignia branded into his chest plate, not sewn, but burned into the alloy itself. Around him, the elite of the Red Doctrine watched her enter. None moved. None raised weapons. They all wanted to see what the myth would do. "You finally came," Vex said, voice calm, reverent. "I knew you would. This place was built for your return." Rose said nothing. Her gaze swept over the room, noting escape routes, pressure sensors, defensive positions. Every breath measured. "You taught us everything," he continued. "What the manuals wouldn't. What command was too afraid to admit. Adaptation. Elimination. Survival through dominance. We made it pure." "You made it hollow," she said, stepping forward. "You copied my survival and turned it into slaughter." "You call it slaughter," Vex replied, lifting his chin. "But we call it clarity. There's no hesitation in our ranks. No weakness. We've transcended fear because of you." "You didn't understand anything," she said, her voice low and steady. "I fought because I had no choice. You fight to worship the echo of pain." He descended from the platform with a soldier's grace, drawing a blade modeled after hers, sleek, double-edged, forged for killing. Then prove I misunderstood. The challenge was unspoken but inevitable. They met in the center of the room, the circle around them silent as death. Vex struck first, quick and practiced. She parried, letting the vibration of the impact tell her more than her eyes could. His movements were clean. Too clean. He had studied her, memorized her. He knew her rhythms. But he didn't feel them. She moved off pattern, broke the flow, switched hands mid-strike, feinted, then struck from an angle she never used before. Vex faltered. She saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes. He adjusted too late. Blood arced across the floor. He stumbled back, panting, blade trembling. This isn't how you fought in the recordings. I didn't fight to be recorded, she said. I fought to live. She disarmed him in 3 moves. Pinned him to the ground with her boot on his chest, blade at his throat. The Red Doctrine soldiers watched, frozen, as the myth they'd built turned against them, not with fury, but clarity. Rose looked down at the boy who had become her shadow. I'm not your weapon. I'm not your scripture. I'm not your God. Vex's lips parted. He might have said something. A prayer. A plea. She never gave him the chance. The hilt of her blade struck him across the temple, clean and final. He dropped unconscious, not dead. She had already seen enough death carved in her name. She stood over him and turned to face the rest. This ends now. Burn your banners. Erase your simulations. Learn to think again. Or keep pretending I'm your answer, and I'll come back. Some lowered their heads. Others simply vanished, silently dispersing like fog with nowhere left to settle. The Red Doctrine collapsed that night, not in fire or gunfire, but in silence. The screens went dark. The compound emptied. One myth replaced with a choice. When she emerged into the dawn, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. The wind carried no ash. Back at Central Command, there was panic, then silence. Then orders to review all units operating under Doctrine parameters. But it was too late. The world had seen her reject what they built. The Doctrine no longer stood unquestioned. In the months that followed, the war shifted again. Less mimicry. More adaptability. Soldiers trained to survive, not to reenact. Her name was removed from the training modules. Her symbol from the armor. A footnote in the files now marked, "Do not replicate. Understand." Rose disappeared. They said she went east, toward the frozen borderlands. Others claimed she was seen training with civilians, teaching children to defend themselves with no names, no titles. A few believed she was dead. Most accepted that she had simply chosen to stop being seen. And yet, in a remote outpost far from war, a young cadet once found an older woman sharpening a blade beneath a frozen tree. Her eyes were quiet. Her movements slow. But when the cadet asked her name, she just said, "I've forgotten it." The cadet hesitated. "Did you used to be someone important?" The woman smiled faintly, adjusted the cadet's stance, and whispered, "Only to those who forgot how to fight for themselves." The legend faded. But the lesson remained. Ask ChatGPT.